Now, welcome back. The National Prosecuting Authority has reached an agreement with McKinsey South Africa for the company to pay more than 1.1 billion rand into South Africa's criminal asset recovery account. And this after the company's former partner, Vikas Sagar, was involved in unlawful and corrupt conduct involving nearly 2 billion rand worth of contracts awarded by Eskom and Transnet from 2012 until 2016. Now, in a statement, McKinsey said that they will continue to cooperate with authorities in both South Africa and the United States in their ongoing investigations. But to talk to us more about these latest developments and, of course, what it means for the fight against corruption, we're joined virtually now by Khaya Sithole, who's a chartered accountant and independent analyst. Khaya, good to have you. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning, and good morning to the viewers.
Now, it's been quite a few years since the revelations at the as a commission of inquiry into allegations of state capture and, of course, the recommendations of its report. But how crucial is this corporate alternative dispute resolution that was reached by the NPA and McKinsey South Africa?
The importance of such a resolution mechanism is that it cuts out the time that otherwise we spend trying to resolve these cases. We do know, unfortunately, that not only do we have institutional limitations within our prosecutions agencies, but also that these entities and these companies tend to have very deep pockets, which means that they can afford to really play the long game in terms of litigation. So if they had stuck to the script of playing the long litigation game, you tend to wait for years in order for cases to be brought forward. I think you can see examples of that in relation to even Eskom and the ABB case, in that if you have this impasse between the litigating parties, it can take many years for it to be resolved. And I think what we then tend to see with these type of resolutions is that it accelerates that time frame, but also obviously puts an end to the whole stretching of resources that would otherwise materialize if we had to keep trying to pursue these individuals who may be based in multiple jurisdictions and companies that are located elsewhere. So it does help us a bit in recovering some of the amounts of the money, and also obviously means that the NPA and other prosecution agencies can then focus on the next case.
Now, Khaya, in their statement released last week, McKinsey said that they had conducted an extensive investigation into the corrupt conduct of former partner Vikas Sagar. But if we look at that, firstly, what, if we can just remind ourselves, what was Sagar's relationship with the Gupta family, and also McKinsey's involvement with Transnet and Eskom as it related to state capture?
So in simple terms, he was obviously the partner in charge of the public sector portfolio of McKinsey in South Africa, which means that he would have been the lead partner responsible for negotiating contracts with Transnet and Eskom. What we also do know is that obviously in line with South Africa's procurement rules, multinational companies like McKinsey have to have a local empowerment partner in order for them to execute on these big contracts. So what you could have done is that you could have simply engaged another fellow South African empowerment compliant, consulting company. But what we then saw is that instead of engaging with those that are already in the market, what you essentially ended up with was that a new company was put together, and this was Trillion. And the responsibility of Trillion was to then play the role of being the 30% partner, but without really the responsibilities associated with being a true empowerment partner. In other words, McKinsey would then say, look, we're going to go and bid for this contract. You guys will come as the partners, but we'll simply pay your fee, but you do not need to do anything. This simply means that we are not actually getting value for money in relation to what was paid to that particular empowerment partner. And that became a relationship that they replicated not only at Eskom, but also at Transnet. So what then became the problem is that when this was discovered, it was very clear that the Trillion company had really become a front for the Gupta family. And what they had simply then identified was a way in which they could partner with McKinsey in multiple contracts and also then inflate the prices of those underlying contracts so that whether it was 30% or whether it was 70%, it was very lucrative for both McKinsey and for Trillion. So that was the essence of the relationship that Sagar had presided over in relation to McKinsey, Trillion, and the state entities.
And one would imagine that this would be very damaging, at the very least, for McKinsey's reputation. You also have the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York, who unsealed Sagar's guilty plea. Now, he pled guilty to participating in a conspiracy to violate the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act before a U.S. district judge in December 2022. But do you think that there will be any prospects of prosecutions? Because I think this is also one of the issues that many lay South Africans are grappling with.
Remarkably unlikely, unfortunately, because I think, as we saw in the case of Bain and SARS, what really ends up happening is that the main role player either leaves the country, and we know South Africa's got a remarkably poor track record in trying to drag those people back into the country in order for them to be held accountable. I think the recent case of Eskom is a rare exception. So we do still have a problem in relation to how we can actually bring back people to be prosecuted in South Africa. But I think also what you're likely to see with the plea of this nature is that it essentially says, look, let us cut off our losses, collective losses, by coming to an agreement. You pay an amount, you admit the guilt, and then you ban yourself from tendering for this state contracts for a particular period of time. So that's what we've seen in relation to this one. Whether this will mean that there's going to be a parallel process where Mr. Sagar is brought back into the country in order to be held accountable, I wouldn't really bank on that, because you probably have to imagine that will require a lot of work for the NPA if that's still on the table. We'll also need to figure out what the understanding was between the NPA and the U.S. Department of Justice in relation to, this is how we're going to finalize the case and this is how we're going to share the spoils, because the amount, which is $122 million is essentially being distributed two ways, into South African authorities and to the U.S. authorities. So that's what we're seeing here. But I think a lot of people will always be very anxious or very concerned about the fact that we never get to see these individuals actually being held accountable in the form of going to jail. It simply becomes a corporate settlement agreement of the nature that you're seeing here. And I don't think we'll ever get the type of satisfaction that we all deserve in relation to the harm that was caused by this conduct.
And then, Khaya, based on all of that, what long-term effects do you think McKinsey's settlement will have on its business relationship, not only with South Africa, but also with other governments and state-owned enterprises, particularly in emerging markets, given what has happened here?
Yeah. Well, sadly, not much, because I think the reality is that McKinsey has got a very poor track record of managing these types of relationships. In fact, this is just one of many cases that they've got ongoing. I think there's an even bigger case that is currently pending relating to how they had advised the Purdue Pharmaceuticals company in relation to the opioid crisis in the United States. That's a much bigger case. I think it's involving about $600 million. They've already reached settlements with different states in relation to how they had materialized. The thing about McKinsey is that they're so big and they're so influential. As soon as this is concluded, there will be another role player eager to sign them up as a consultant, and unfortunately that even involves governments. So it's not a matter of them taking one hit and then being completely decimated from procurement. They are so big and so influential, there's always somebody willing to sign them up, irrespective of the fact that they've been found to be so complicit in so many problems and so many transactions that are very dubious, including, in fact, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi a couple of years ago. But unfortunately, it's too big to fail, according to those that make such decisions.
Wow. And also then looking at South Africa and their involvement in allegations of state capture here, is the South African government doing currently or likely to do business with McKinsey and Company again?
So what we should have seen is that they should have been blacklisted. So you and I know that National Treasury is supposed to publish a list of entities that no one is supposed to do business with. It's a very dodgy list, because sometimes you listen to stories, you read investigation reports, and you assume that a company is going to be there only for them not to show up. So it's not very clear whether there is a standing commitment not to do business with them. We also unfortunately know that even in the business community in South Africa, they are still extensively used. And the fact that they're extensively used means that people are willing to overlook the nature of the issues that were raised out there, and then be able to say that we think you've done or you've atoned enough in order for you to be engaged as a service provider again. The script seems to be that as soon as you remove the person who was leading that particular process, so whether it's the case of Bain, where their managing partner is the one that essentially left the country, or whether it's in the case of McKinsey, where they'll say, look, the man who was in charge and whoever else worked with him is no longer part of us, or whether it's in the case of KPMG, where they simply say that those who were around when the bad things went on are no longer here. That seems to be the playbook that these corporate entities tend to play. And as soon as they say that, look, we've cleaned ourselves up, they seem to be really able to embed themselves back into service provider contracts across the state and within the public sector. And that's probably reflective of just how dependent these companies have become on this, either the big four auditing firms or even the big three consulting companies. So it's something that we see unfortunately being repeated in many instances, where you would think that given the scale of the harm that was caused, nobody should be willing to engage with them. But as it turns out, it's not as clear as we'd like it to be, and somebody's going to hire them today and tomorrow.
But one would imagine, Khaya, that at the very least, this case, for example, would influence, at the very least, perhaps the regulatory landscape for international consulting firms operating in countries like South Africa or other countries with governance challenges. Has it, though?
Not really. So the answer would simply be that the authorities and the regulator would say, look, the best they could come up with is a law like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that the United States has put together. And in South Africa, you'd say that, look, we've got the laws that are meant to actually manage all of these things when it gets discovered. The problem comes at the point of discovery. So what you then see is that we've got a very high reliance on whistleblowers, for example, and in some jurisdictions, whistleblowers actually do get a share of the spoils, a share of the windfall, in order to obviously incentivize them to expose what they see or what they may be witnessing as corruption. South Africa doesn't have a very strong track record when it comes to the protection of whistleblowers. So you imagine that there's a lot of people who see things and simply prefer to walk away instead of getting entangled into the process of exposing their corruption and then ultimately making sure that things like this are addressed. So I think the regulators will come back and say, look, we've created enough rules in order for us to be able to deal with what we can find. We cannot be perpetually engaged in the process of trying to create rules for an ever-evolving system, because they'll simply never catch up. Those that seek to perpetuate crimes, those that seek to be corrupt, are always, unfortunately, a step ahead of whatever regulations that you have.
And to come back to your point that you made about the company saying that the person who was in charge is no longer with them, and using that as an excuse basically of how they may have cleaned house. Is there any indication that McKinsey and Company has taken any further steps to improve their own internal controls in order to prevent similar issues in the future?
Ironically, yes. So they had a previous CEO, Kevin Sneeder, who actually did indeed offer even an apology to South Africa when he did discover the scale of what had happened, and McKinsey rewarded him by simply firing him. So one of the commitments that they've made there is that obviously there's going to be, I think, a global compliance and ethics officer, which seems to imply that they wanted to put someone very senior in charge to be able to really guide the conduct of how their consultants across the globe engage, and particularly how they engage in these high-risk jurisdictions where the prospect of being bribed and the prospect of paying, these kickbacks is regarded as much higher than it is in other jurisdictions. So if they have done that and they've put that together, you'd imagine that it's a much better process than what used to be before. But when they then actually didn't keep the CEO who initiated all of that and replaced him with someone else, you had to wonder about just how committed they were to that whole cultural change and that cultural shift. And of course, they do operate in a very, very opaque space, in the sense that a lot of us will never actually get to see what they do and how they do it. They tend to keep their client engagements remarkably confidential. So a lot of people will actually never be in a position to even figure out what it takes to run the business of the scale and the profitability that McKinsey, Bain, and even the Boston Consulting Group tend to engage in.
Well, it still leaves so many questions around things like corporate responsibility, Khaya, but unfortunately we have run out of time. But thanks so much for your insights this morning. Khaya Sithole, a chartered accountant and independent analyst, talking to us about the National Prosecuting Authority reaching a final agreement with McKinsey South Africa for the firm to pay back more than 1 billion rand for its former partner's role and involvement in state capture.